For 2,000 years, there's one book in the Bible that has absolutely captivated us and maybe terrified us a little bit more than any other, the book of Revelation. But what if we've been reading it backwards? What if the key to unlocking it isn't in our future, but deep in the past?
Seriously, take a second. When I say apocalypse, what pops into your head? I'm guessing it's Armageddon, right? The Antichrist, huge cosmic battles, a kind of terrifying roadmap of what's to come. It's an image we all know so well.
But what if that whole picture, that entire way of looking at it, is just wrong? What if the apocalypse isn't about what's going to happen, but is actually a mind-bending, symbolic story about what already happened?
And that brings us to this really radical new key, proposed by author Noel Robertson Platt. He makes the case that Revelation isn't prophecy in the way we usually think of it. No, he says, it's something totally different.
Here it is, the core idea. The entire book of Revelation is an allegory for the Easter story. All those crazy visions aren't literal predictions. They're symbolic pictures of Christ's passion, his death, and his resurrection.
So what's an allegory, really? You know, the easiest way to think about it is like a political cartoon. You see all these weird characters and symbols, but you know they're not literal. They're pointing to something real, a real person, a real event. That's the exact framework we're using here. Okay, so you gotta ask, why would the Apostle John write such a complex, coded message? Well, the argument is that he was fighting a very specific battle of ideas raging in the first century. It was a heresy called Docetism. These guys were saying Jesus was basically a ghost, a spirit who only looked human. And John, well, he supposedly wrote Revelation to scream from the rooftops that Jesus was real, physical, flesh and blood. So here's the most important part of this whole idea. You have to learn to see two layers at once. There's the top layer, what the author calls the illusion. That's all the wild apocalyptic stuff, the beasts and battles. But right underneath it is the reality, the actual historical events of the Easter story that those visions are pointing to.
Now that is a fascinating idea for sure, but is there any real proof in the text itself? Well, the author says yes, there is a smoking gun. And it's a clear, sequential timeline that perfectly connects Revelation's story to the Easter story.
Okay, look at how this builds. Once you start using this key, a pattern just jumps out at you. Revelation 16 suddenly looks like an allegory for Christ's suffering, his passion. Then chapter 17 lines up with his death. Chapter 18 becomes a picture of his burial. And, you guessed it, chapter 20 symbolizes his resurrection. Once you see that sequence, the theory goes, it's pretty hard to unsee it.
To really see this thing in action, let's do a deep dive. We're going to zoom in on one of the most famous chapters of all, Revelation 19. This is where the rubber really meets the road.
So the chapter kicks off with this massive, triumphant chorus. You've probably heard it in Handel's Messiah. Now, the traditional view is that this is some future party in heaven. But in this new model, it's an allegory for something happening right down here on Earth during Easter week.
And boom, here's the first connection. That heavenly hallelujah chorus is seen as a direct parallel to the great Hallel. This was a specific set of psalms that religious Jews were singing at that very moment, during the Passover feast, to celebrate God's redemption. It was the real-world soundtrack to the crucifixion.
Okay, next up in the chapter, we get another famous image, the marriage supper of the Lamb. Again, traditionally this is seen as a future event, but what if it's pointing to a very practical detail from the Gospels?
This is a perfect example of how the decoding works. The Gospel of John makes a point to tell us that Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation. Well, what were people preparing? Food. They were getting everything ready for the big Sabbath meal. A day of preparing food implies a supper. So the allegorical marriage supper is rooted in the very real, historical day of preparation.
And then we get to the main event, the image everyone knows, the iconic rider on the white horse. For most people, this is it. This is the final battle, Armageddon.
But in this allegorical reading, this Battle of Armageddon isn't some literal future war at all. It's a symbolic, spiritual showdown depicting the most important moment of the entire Easter story.
Let's break this down. It's amazing. The theory argues that the white horse rider coming down from heaven isn't Jesus at the second coming. It's an allegory for the angel of the Lord descending to the tomb on Easter morning. The armies of the beast, they're not demons. They're the Roman soldiers standing guard. And the false prophet, the one connected to the mark of the beast, that symbolizes the official seal of Rome that was placed on the tomb, a seal the angel shatters, showing heaven's authority over Rome's.
This reading even has an answer for a tricky little detail. Why are there two figures, a rider and an angel? Well, the theory points right back to Matthew's Gospel, which uses the specific phrase, angel of the Lord. It argues John pulls off this incredible bit of literary wordplay, splitting that one title into two powerful symbols, the angel in the sun and the rider whose name is Lord of Lords. It's a really clever way to encode the source.
So, okay, let's zoom back out for a second. What's the big deal here? Why does changing Revelation from a story about the future to a testimony about the past really change anything? Well, it kind of changes everything.
So what are the big takeaways? 1. It turns Revelation into an urgent first-century defense of a very real, physical Jesus against a heresy that said he wasn't. 2. It completely redefines prophecy. It's not about telling the future, it's about testifying to the core message of the gospel. 3. It totally solves that awkward 2,000-year gap where we've been waiting for these things to happen. And finally, it transforms these huge future battles into beautiful allegories for the spiritual victory that was already won at Easter.
And what's really amazing is that this whole model finds its biblical proof right here, in the same chapter. Revelation seems to tell us exactly what it's doing. The text literally says the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. It's not about predicting the future. It's about telling the story of what Jesus has already done.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty big thought. This isn't just about one book. If prophecy can actually be a creative, powerful, allegorical testimony about the past, instead of just a literal roadmap of the future, well, how could that change the way we read and understand other ancient, sacred texts? That's a question worth thinking about.